The 12th of January, 1888, 9 o'clock in the morning, western Nebraska. The thermometer read 44 degrees Fahrenheit. Children across Custer County had walked to school in their shirt sleeves, farmers had opened windows, and a few ranch wives were doing laundry outdoors. By 2 in the afternoon, the temperature had dropped 18 degrees in 3 minutes. A wall of Arctic air traveling at 60 miles per hour erased the entire morning, turned the sky the color of a dead fire, and began killing people where they stood. By 9 o'clock that night, the temperature had plunged past -11 Fahrenheit, and by morning, some stations across the northern plains read -42. 235 people died, and some estimates run as high as 500. The ones who survived inside their buildings had their survival determined entirely by what their walls were made of. There was one old rancher on a hillside 7 miles north of Broken Bow, Nebraska, who didn't lose a single animal that night, never burned his furniture for heat, and woke up the next morning to find his nearest neighbor's log cabin had a water bucket frozen solid 6 feet from a roaring stove. His name was Walter Creed. He was 61 years old. He had been on that land since 1874. And unlike nearly every man who had arrived after him, he had never once been talked out of living in the ground. People had been calling him a fool since 1874. Not behind his back either, but directly to his face, the way men on the frontier considered honesty a virtue and tact a weakness. When newer settlers rolled into Custer County through the late 1870s, carrying Eastern ideas about proper houses, squared timber, plank floors, shingle roofs, they looked at Walter Creed's hillside and shook their heads. "You live like a badger," one neighbor told him in 1879, and he meant it as an insult. Creed didn't argue, because he had been warm through every winter that had nearly killed someone else in that county. He had seen the Easter blizzard of April 1873 stacked drifts 18 to 20 feet deep across Nebraska. He had watched the hard winter of 1880 to 1881 come down hard enough that trains stopped running from January through May in Dakota Territory. He had watched men who'd arrived with sawn lumber and architectural pride burn their furniture by February, and he just kept living in his hillside. Here is what that actually looked like, and why it worked the way physics says it should. In 1874, Walter Creed did not build a house, he dug one. He found a south-facing slope with a natural rise of about 6 feet, not rare in the rolling sandhills country of central Nebraska, and he excavated 4 feet into the hillside itself so that the front of the structure would face south, catching winter sun. 3 walls would be the earth itself, and one wall, the south face, he built up from sod bricks he cut from the unbroken prairie with a spade. Those sod bricks measured about 12 inches wide, 2 feet long, and 4 inches thick, and a single brick weighed 50 pounds. He laid them grass side down in staggered courses, 2 blocks deep, the way a mason lays stone, each course offset from the one below, so no vertical joint ran from top to bottom. He packed the gaps with loose dirt. He cut additional courses crosswise every few layers as a binding course to lock the wall together. And when he was done, his front wall was 26 inches thick. The floor he tamped with a fence post until it was as hard and smooth as finished concrete. The roof was poles cut from cedar he hauled 40 miles, laid across a central ridgepole, covered first with dried prairie grass, big bluestem, and buffalo grass laid thick as a mattress, and then covered with a double layer of sod blocks, and that roof weighed over 3 tons. The whole structure cost him under $5 and took him 8 days to build. His nearest neighbor that year, a man named Gideon Marsh, who arrived from Indiana in 1876, built a log cabin, hauling cottonwood from the Republican River Valley, notching and stacking the logs to a wall height of 8 feet, chinking the gaps with clay and lime. And he was proud of it because it looked like something back home. That distinction between the man who built something that looked familiar and the man who built something that worked is the entire story of what happened on the 12th of January 1888. Before getting to that morning, it is necessary to understand the physics of what Walter Creed had actually built, because this is where most people miss the point entirely. Most people assume a buried structure stays warm because it is sheltered from wind, and that is true, but it is the least important part of what was happening inside that hillside. The critical piece is something called the geothermal baseline. Below a depth of about 4 to 6 feet in Nebraska soil, the ground temperature does not follow the weather and does not follow the seasons. It follows the slow, steady heat rising from the Earth's interior, averaged out over decades of surface temperature. At 4 to 6 feet deep in Nebraska, soil temperature ranges from roughly 34 to 64 degrees across the entire year, and even in a January that kills livestock left standing in open fields, the soil 6 feet down in Nebraska holds somewhere between 35 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit. That means Walter Creed's 3 earthen walls were never conducting heat against a 40 below zero temperature differential. They were conducting heat against a temperature differential of maybe 15 to 30 degrees, because the buried earth surrounding him on 3 sides and above him was sitting at 45 degrees rather than 40 below zero all winter long. The heat loss through a wall is calculated by dividing the temperature difference by the wall's resistance to heat flow. It's R value, and if you cut the temperature difference in half, you cut your heat loss in half. Walter Creed didn't cut his temperature differential in half. On the worst nights of that 1,888 blizzard, when outside air hit -42 Fahrenheit, his surrounding earth was still at 45 degrees. His indoor temperature near the stove sat around 60 degrees, and that means his walls were conducting heat across a 15-degree gap, while his neighbor Gideon Marsh's log cabin walls were conducting heat across a gap of over 100 degrees. The law of physics says Marsh needed more than 6 times the heat output just to maintain the same interior temperature, not because he had thinner walls, though he did, but because his walls were fighting the actual outside air instead of the stable earth. Dense materials hold heat, and prairie sod-packed roots, compressed dirt, interlocked grass fibers weighs between 90 and 130 pounds per cubic foot, while a softwood log weighs 25 to 35 pounds per cubic foot, making sod roughly 4 times denser than the walls of a log cabin, and those density numbers translate directly into heat storage capacity. Walter Creed's front wall alone, 26 inches thick, built from sod, stored roughly 14 times more heat per degree of temperature change than Gideon Marsh's log wall. And his roof, 3 tons of packed earth and sod blocks, acted like a slow-moving battery, warming through the day from the stove below, then releasing that stored heat back into the room through the night, like a cast-iron skillet holding warmth long after the fire dies. When Gideon Marsh's fire went out at 2 in the morning on January 13, and it did go out, because the wind-driven snow had packed his firewood stack against the cabin wall and buried it under 6 feet of drift, his interior temperature dropped roughly 3 degrees per hour. He reached freezing inside that cabin in 8 hours, and his water bucket froze before dawn. When the small fire in Walter Creed's stove went low, the temperature inside his dugout barely moved for the first several hours, because the surrounding earth was releasing heat from its mass. The 3-ton roof was releasing heat from its mass, and the ground beneath his tamped earth floor 4 feet below the surface was sitting at 40 degrees, fighting hard against any further cooling, and it would have taken a full day or more for that structure to cool to dangerous temperatures without any fire at all. This is Fourier's law of heat conduction, applied to real materials with real measurements. There was one more feature of Creed's dugout that his neighbors never figured out, partly because it was invisible, and partly because it looked like a mistake. His entrance was not a door in the front wall, but a short, descending tunnel dug into the hillside at a right angle to the living space, turning 90 degrees before it opened into the room, so that a person stepped down into the tunnel from outside, walked forward, turned the corner, and stepped up slightly into the room. People who saw it thought he was being eccentric, or paranoid, or that he hadn't thought it through properly and ended up with a crooked door because he miscalculated, but he hadn't miscalculated. Cold air is denser than warm air at 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Air weighs about 0.086 pounds per cubic foot, and at 55 degrees Fahrenheit it weighs about 0.077 pounds per cubic foot, roughly 12% lighter. And because cold air sinks while warm air rises, this is not a metaphor but the physical behavior of gas molecules at different energy levels. When an Arctic wind hit the entrance to that descending tunnel, The cold air it pushed denser, heavier flowed down and pooled at the bottom of the tunnel like water pooling at the low point of a drain. The warm interior air floated above the cold plug. The right-angle turn broke the wind's momentum before it could push through mechanically, and the system worked the way a trap works under a kitchen sink, a liquid seal that prevents backflow. Except here, the seal was made of cold air too heavy to climb back out of the trap it had fallen into. The Mandan people of the upper Missouri River had understood this principle for centuries before Walter Creed was born. Their earth lodges' floors dug 2 to 4 feet below grade, entrance tunnels running 6 to 14 feet, oriented away from the prevailing northwest winter wind, achieved interior temperatures that the painter George Catlin personally witnessed in 1832 and recorded as perfectly warm when the outdoor temperature stood at 40 degrees below zero. These were sophisticated cold climate engineering solutions that indigenous people of the northern plains developed, refined, and passed down over many generations, and Walter Creed lived near enough to the old Pawnee trade routes that he had almost certainly seen or heard descriptions of those structures. Whether he drew directly on that knowledge or arrived at similar conclusions through 14 years of cold winters, his entrance tunnel performed the same physics. Now come back to the 12th of January 1888, the morning that ended arguments. The front hit at 2:17 in the afternoon by the Broken Bow courthouse clock, according to the account preserved in the Custer County newspaper that week, and the temperature dropped from 41 degrees to 23 in the time it took a man to walk from the feed store to the livery stable. Within the hour, it was below zero. The wind hit 60 miles per hour out of the northwest, and the snow wasn't falling but moving horizontally, ice crystals fine as flour that froze eyelids shut and found every gap in every wall. Lois Royce, a teacher in a frame schoolhouse near Plainview, Nebraska, ran out of fuel by 3 o'clock that afternoon, attempted to lead 3 of her students, the 82 yards between the schoolhouse and her boarding house, and all 3 children froze to death in the whiteout while she survived with severe frostbite. The Grant County Historical Society recorded what happened to families in tar paper-covered wood frame homes. The wind ripped the tar paper from the walls and the buildings became, in their words, open to the storm, and people froze to death inside their own walls. Gideon Marsh, 7 miles south of Walter Creed's hillside, burned everything combustible he owned except his door frame to keep from freezing. His wife wrapped the children in every piece of clothing they owned, and they huddled together under 3 layers of quilts on the bed. And when a Custer County survey crew came through 3 days later, they found Marsh had used his axe handle as fuel before it was over, lost 2 of his cattle, and his water line was still frozen in February. Walter Creed lost nothing. His animals were in a sod-walled corral attached to the hillside, the same earth construction, and the same thermal logic applied to livestock shelter. His firewood stacked against the back slope of the dugout under a sod. Overhang was accessible. His water stored in the coolest corner of the dugout floor had not frozen. And when the storm broke on January 14th, he dug out his entrance tunnel, walked to his neighbors, and helped dig them out. The Custer County newspaper account preserved in the Nebraska State Historical Society archives noted that the families who had built into hillsides or used heavy sod construction fared substantially better than those in frame buildings, and one correspondent wrote that a rancher on the Republican River breaks who had refused to abandon his original dugout even after his neighbors moved into framed houses had not lost a single head and showed no evidence of distress. He didn't name the rancher, but that was the account Walter Creed's grandson, Harold Creed of Broken Bow, Nebraska, always said described his grandfather. A standard log cabin in western Nebraska in 1888 had walls averaging 6 to 8 inches of softwood, an R value of roughly R5 to R8. Its shingle roof had an R value of about R2.75. And critically, as green logs dried over the first year or two, they shrank 15 to 20%, opening gaps between every course that wind could drive directly through. At air change, rates of 2 to 5 complete exchanges per hour, which is what Great Plains blizzard winds pushed through standard log chinking, a 14 by 16-foot cabin was replacing its entire volume of warm air with Arctic air multiple times every single hour. Walter Creed's front sod wall, 26 inches thick, had an R value of R9 to R13 just from the sod itself, before accounting for the trapped air insulation value of dried prairie grass root networks, and his 3 earthen walls had no gaps, no chinking, and no shrinkage cycles. His sod roof, with its dried grass underlayer and double sod block topping, had an effective R value of R10 to R13, and his infiltration rate, the air leaking in and out, was measured in fractions of an air change per hour, because earthen walls cannot crack open to wind pressure. Total heat loss through the walls, roof, and infiltration of Gideon Marsh's log cabin on that January night ran between 13,000 and 25,000 BTU per hour, while total heat loss from Walter Creed's dugout under the same conditions ran between 1,500 and 3,000 BTU per hour, a roughly 10-to-1 difference, and a small stove burning 30 pounds of tea. Dry cottonwood per night could manage 3,000 BTU per hour of continuous output without difficulty, while keeping Gideon Marsh's cabin livable in those conditions required burning furniture. This is why the experienced men on the frontier, the ones who had been there since the early 1870s, who had survived the Easter blizzard of 1873 and the hard winter of 1880, chose hillside dugouts. Not because they lacked ambition and not because they couldn't build anything better, but because they understood through accumulated experience what physics confirms through calculation. The ground itself was the furnace, and the sod was the insulation that let them run that furnace on almost nothing. Gideon Marsh built a sod addition onto his log cabin in the fall of 1888 and never admitted why. 2 other neighbors, who had mocked Walter Creed for living like a badger, applied to the county land office that same fall to adjust the placement of their outbuildings, moving them into the lee of a hillside. And one of them stopped by Creed's place in October and spent 2 hours walking around the structure, looking at the entrance tunnel, looking at the sod roof, not saying much. Walter Creed was 62 years old by then, had been on that land for 14 years, and would stay for another 11, finally moving to Broken Bow in 1899 at the age of 73, when his grandson's family came out from Missouri and took over the ranch. He left the dugout intact, and his grandson Harold, who told the story to a Nebraska State Historical Society field interviewer in 1932, said the structure was still standing that year, 58 years after it was built, still used for cold storage, the walls still solid, the earth roof still holding, and the entrance tunnel still designed the way it had always been, descending, right-angling, trapping the cold air at the bottom so the warm air above never had to fight it. The log cabin Gideon Marsh built in 1876 had been torn down and rebuilt twice by 1932, and the sod addition he put on in 1888 outlasted both rebuilds. The children's blizzard killed up to 500 people across the Great Plains in 36 hours, and historians who have studied the mortality patterns note that the deaths concentrated among people caught in the open between buildings and people in thin-walled frame or tar paper structures that failed under the wind load and temperature drop. The pattern of who survived inside structures lines up almost exactly with wall mass and burial depth, those with the most earth around them, the lowest profile against the landscape, the walls that the wind passed over rather than through, came through with the least damage, while those whose walls were fighting 100-degree temperature differentials with 5 inches of softwood lost the fight before midnight. Walter Creed had not been lucky. He had been right about the physics of where heat goes and why, about the value of what the land itself could offer if you were willing to build with it instead of on top of it, and about what 40 years of northern plains winters had already proven to the Mandan and the Pawnee before a single European settler drove a stake into that soil. When his grandson Harold described that 1888 blizzard to the Nebraska State Historical Society interviewer, he said his grandfather had told him something about that winter that Harold had never forgotten, and Walter Creed said, "The ones who lost the most were the ones who built what looked right. I built what worked." A sod dugout buried 4 feet into a south-facing Nebraska hillside, with 26-inch walls and a 3-ton roof, and a descending entrance tunnel that trapped the cold air before it could reach the room. Kept 55 degrees more warmth inside than the ambient air outside on the worst night of the worst blizzard in Plains history because of geothermal buffering, thermal mass, dead air insulation, and cold air density stratification. 4. Real, measurable, demonstrable physical principles that Walter Creed had been living inside for 14 years before anyone else in Custer County believed him.